Number 10. The Carnac Stones. In western France, stretching across the landscape in long, haunting rows, stand thousands of ancient stones placed with a precision and scale that still feel deeply unnatural to modern eyes. This is Karnak, one of the largest megalithic sites in the world, where countless standing stones extend across fields in ordered alignments that have puzzled researchers for generations. Even now, despite excavation, dating efforts, and modern archaeological study, no one can say with complete confidence why they were arranged this way. That uncertainty is what makes Karnak so unsettling. It is not just one monument, not one stone circle, not one tomb or shrine. It is an enormous ceremonial landscape, a pattern imposed across the land by people who clearly had intention, organization, and a reason strong enough to move and place massive stones in staggering numbers. Some theories connect the site to ritual, astronomy, territory, ancestor worship, or social identity. All of those ideas offer pieces of an answer. None of them fully dissolve the mystery. Part of the challenge is that the stones belong to a world so distant that its meanings may no longer survive in any direct form. The builders left no written explanation, no inscription telling later generations what the alignments were meant to represent. We can measure spacing, orientation, and context. We can compare the rows to burial structures and nearby features. But even with that information, the overall logic of the site still remains frustratingly incomplete. It looks deliberate on a massive scale, yet its deeper purpose remains out of reach. And that is why Karnak belongs on this list. It reminds us that science can map a mystery without necessarily solving it. The stones still stand, silent and ordered, as if they once formed part of a message written across the earth itself. But whatever that message was, the people who knew how to read it are gone, and the landscape has kept their secret for thousands of years. Number 9. The stone spheres of Costa Rica, scattered across parts of Costa Rica, are ancient stone spheres so smooth, so carefully shaped, and so strangely perfect that they seem almost impossible at first glance. Some are small enough to hold in the arms. Others are massive, weighing many tons. Together they form one of the most unusual archaeological mysteries in the Americas, because even after decades of study, the full reason for their creation is still unknown. What makes the spheres so extraordinary is not just their shape, but the level of craftsmanship they suggest. These were not rough stones casually rounded by erosion. They were deliberately worked into near-perfect forms by human hands long before modern machinery existed. Archaeologists link many of them to the Diki culture, but knowing who likely made them does not fully answer why they were made, how they were displayed, or what meanings they carried in the lives of the people who created them. Some researchers believe the spheres may have marked elite spaces, ceremonial areas, social rank, or astronomical alignments. Others think they could have functioned as symbols of power, prestige, or cosmic order. The difficulty is that many spheres were moved from their original settings over time, especially during the modern era, which means some of the archaeological context that might have explained them was damaged or lost before careful study could take place. In that sense, science is trying to solve a mystery with part of the original evidence already disturbed. That only makes them more haunting. Because the spheres are so unmistakably intentional, they seem to promise an answer just beyond reach. They were difficult to make, difficult to transport, and significant enough to place in important locations, yet the meaning behind that effort remains elusive. Science can confirm their craftsmanship, estimate their age, and trace their cultural setting, but the deeper question still stands untouched at the center of every polished curve. Why did the ancient world need stones shaped like this at all? Number 8. The Ulfberht swords. In the Viking Age, a small group of swords appeared in Europe that seemed to belong to a level of metallurgy far beyond what most people would expect from the early medieval world. These blades were marked with the name Ulfberht, and what made them so extraordinary was not only their craftsmanship, but the metal itself. Some analyses suggested that certain genuine examples were forged from steel of unusually high purity, with properties far superior to many other weapons of the time. That is where the mystery begins. Producing metal of that quality required heat control and refinement techniques that were not thought to be common in Europe during the period. In simple terms, some Ulfberht swords looked too advanced for the age that made them. That does not mean they were impossible, and it certainly does not mean magic or fantasy. But it does mean they point toward trade networks, specialist knowledge, or metallurgical methods that remain more impressive and more complex than older assumptions once allowed. Part of the difficulty is that not all Ulfberht swords are the same. Some were likely high-quality originals, while others may have been imitations trying to copy the prestige of the name. That creates another layer of uncertainty. Science can test composition, compare impurities, study forging structure, and distinguish superior blades from lesser ones. But even after doing so, one central question still remains. How did the makers of the best examples gain access to such remarkable material, and why did this level of quality appear so unevenly? That is why the Ulfberht swords belong on this list. They force modern analysis to admit that early medieval technology may have been more globally connected, more specialized, and more capable than the simplified image many people still carry. The swords survive as sharp steel reminders that the ancient and early historical world did not always develop in the slow, primitive line we imagine. Sometimes it produced something so advanced that even science must step back and ask how knowledge like that moved so far, so early, and so quietly. Number 7. The Cocknow stone, hidden beneath grass, soil, and long periods of obscurity in Scotland, lies one of the strangest carved surfaces in prehistoric Europe. Known as the Cocknow stone, this massive sandstone slab is covered with complex markings, cup and ring carvings, grooves, spirals, and geometric patterns cut into the rock thousands of years ago. At first glance, it feels less like a normal archaeological object and more like a coded surface waiting for someone who never arrived. What makes the Cocknow stone so unsettling is the density and scale of its markings. These are not random scratches. They were deliberately carved across a large stone in patterns that clearly meant something to the people who made them. Yet despite all the attention given to prehistoric rock art, no one has been able to explain with certainty what these symbols were for. Some researchers connect them to ritual landscapes, territorial markers, cosmology, maps, or sacred communication. But even the most serious interpretations remain incomplete. Part of the mystery comes from the fact that science can document the carvings in great detail without being able to recover the worldview behind them. The lines can be scanned, the grooves can be measured, the stone can be dated by context. But none of that gives us the cultural key needed to decode the patterns. It is the same frustration that defines so many ancient mysteries. We can see the design clearly, but not the meaning. And that is what gives the Cocknow stone its eerie power. It looks like a message preserved almost too well, a deliberate surface of signs made to be read, walked around, contemplated, or used in ways now completely lost. Science can prove that human hands created it. It can confirm its antiquity and map every symbol. But the real secret remains untouched beneath the measurements. The people who carved the stone left behind a pattern that still feels like language without translation, and after thousands of years, the rock continues to keep its silence. Number 6. The Sangsingdui masks. When archaeologists excavated the ancient site of Sangsingdui in China, what emerged from the ground looked less like ordinary history and more like something from another symbolic world entirely. Among the most startling discoveries were enormous bronze masks with exaggerated eyes, sharp features, and expressions so unnatural that they seemed to challenge everything people thought they knew about early Chinese civilization. These were not familiar royal portraits or conventional ritual objects. They felt alien, theatrical, and deeply charged with meaning. That is exactly what makes Sangsingdui so mysterious. The civilization behind the site was clearly sophisticated, producing extraordinary bronzework, gold artifacts, jade, and ceremonial objects on a remarkable scale. Yet the masks still resist simple explanation. Why were the eyes so exaggerated? Why were the faces so stylized? And what kind of ritual or cosmological system required imagery this strange and this powerful? Science can analyze the metal, date the context, and trace the craftsmanship, but the symbolic logic behind the masks remains far more difficult to recover. Some researchers believe the masks were connected to ancestral worship, divine beings, or ritual performances tied to a sacred worldview now mostly lost. Others see them as expressions of a regional culture whose religious imagination differed sharply from later traditions that came to dominate written Chinese history. That possibility is especially unsettling because it suggests that entire systems of belief may have flourished at high levels of sophistication and then faded so completely that only their ceremonial faces remained. And that is why the Sangsingdui masks belong on this list. They show that science can uncover an object, identify its materials, and place it in time, yet still stand almost helpless before its meaning. The masks look back at us with impossible eyes, as if they were made for a ritual we no longer understand, and perhaps were never meant to understand. They are a reminder that some of the ancient world's strangest creations are not mysteries because they were hidden, but because the world that made them no longer exists to explain itself. Number 5. The Baalbek Trilithon. In Lebanon, beneath and around the later Roman temples of Baalbek, lie some of the largest stone blocks ever used in ancient construction. The most famous of them, known as the Trilithon, consists of massive stones set high within the platform, each weighing hundreds of tons. Nearby quarries contain even larger unfinished blocks, making the entire site feel less like ordinary architecture and more like a direct challenge to the limits of ancient engineering. What makes Baalbek so difficult to explain is not that people deny ancient builders were skilled. It is that the scale involved still feels almost unreasonable. These were not just big stones, they were enormous, cut, moved, and positioned with a level of planning that remains hard to fully reconstruct even with modern engineering analysis. Science can estimate weight, study stone type, examine quarry marks, and model possible transport methods. But that still leaves the central question hanging in the air. Why build on this scale at all, and how was such ambition successfully carried out? Mainstream explanations generally place the visible temple complex within the Roman period, and Roman engineers were certainly capable of astonishing feats. But even within that context, Baalbek continues to provoke debate because the sheer magnitude of the stones seems to exceed what most people imagine ancient construction could comfortably handle. The problem is not that science has no theories. The problem is that every theory must confront a visual reality so extreme that it still feels almost unbelievable in person. That is why the Baalbek Trilithon belongs here. It forces science into an uneasy position where the evidence proves human construction, but the practical and symbolic logic of that construction still feels incomplete. The stones are real, their size is measurable, their placement is undeniable, and yet something about them continues to resist emotional closure. They stand as one of the clearest reminders that the ancient world sometimes built at a scale so overwhelming that even when we know it was done by human hands, we still struggle to understand what kind of world believed such stones were necessary in the first place. Number 4. The Saqqara bird. In 1898, archaeologists excavating a tomb at Saqqara, Egypt, discovered a small wooden object that at first seemed unremarkable, just another carved bird from the ancient world. But the more closely it was examined, the stranger it became. Unlike typical decorative bird figures, this object had rigid wings, a vertical tail, and a body shape that looked unexpectedly aerodynamic. It did not resemble a natural bird as much as it resembled a glider. That is what has kept the Saqqara bird alive as a mystery for so long. Some researchers have argued that it may preserve an ancient intuition about flight, balance, or airflow, perhaps not as a working aircraft, but as a model shaped by observations that went further than we usually credit to the ancient world. Others remain skeptical, seeing it as a toy, a symbolic object, or simply a stylized carving that later generations have overinterpreted. Science can examine its proportions, test replicas, and compare its form to known aerodynamics. But those studies still do not produce one final answer that closes the case. Part of what makes the object so difficult is that it sits exactly on the border between coincidence and intention. If it was only a toy, why was it shaped this way? If it reflected some practical understanding, where is the larger tradition behind it? There is no surviving archive explaining it, no workshop manual, no broader set of clearly related devices. What remains is one small object carrying a disproportionately large question, and that is why the Saqqara bird belongs on this list. It is a perfect example of how science can test possibilities without fully dissolving wonder. The wood can be measured, the shape can be modeled, and the theories can be argued, yet the object still refuses to become ordinary. It sits there in silence, carved thousands of years ago, still making modern minds ask whether the ancient world sometimes glimpsed ideas that history never fully preserved. Number 3. The underwater city of Dwarka. Off the western coast of India, beneath the waters of the Arabian Sea, lie submerged remains that have fueled fascination, debate, and mystery for decades. Marine archaeologists working near modern Dwarka uncovered stone structures, blocks, anchors, and traces, suggesting that an ancient settlement or settlements once existed where the sea now stretches. For many observers, the implications were immediately electrifying. Could this be a real city lost beneath the water, remembered only in fragments of legend and myth? That is what makes Dwarka so difficult for science to fully resolve. Underwater archaeology can map structures, recover artifacts, and establish some chronological boundaries. But the sea complicates everything. Currents shift material. Context becomes harder to preserve. Interpretation becomes more fragile. Researchers can identify signs of human activity, but linking every submerged feature into one clear and uncontested picture of a single lost city is far more difficult. The evidence points towards something significant, yet the final shape of that something remains debated. The mystery deepens because Dwarka occupies the dangerous edge between archaeology and cultural memory. In Indian tradition, Dwarka is associated with a legendary city tied to Krishna, a place of splendor later swallowed by the sea. That does not automatically mean every underwater discovery in the region confirms the full traditional account, but it does create a powerful tension. Science can document stones, artifacts, and submerged features. It cannot so easily separate those findings from the much older human instinct to believe that stories may preserve distorted memories of real places lost to time. And that is why the underwater city of Dwarka belongs so high on this list. It shows that even with sonar, dives, excavation, and modern analysis, some ancient mysteries remain suspended between evidence and meaning. Something is there. Something was built. Something was lost to the water. But the full truth still seems just beyond reach, hidden beneath sediment, movement, and time. Dwarka remains one of the clearest reminders that science can illuminate the outline of a mystery while leaving its deepest question unanswered. What exactly vanished beneath the sea, and how much of its story survived only because people refused to stop remembering it? Number 2. The Emerald Tablet legend. Few ancient mysteries have cast a longer shadow over the imagination than the legend of the Emerald Tablet. For centuries, it has been associated with hidden wisdom, secret knowledge, and the idea that the ancient world may have preserved truths too profound or too dangerous to survive in ordinary form. The most famous line connected to it, "As above, so below," has echoed through alchemy, mysticism, occult thought, and later esoteric traditions, giving the tablet a reputation far greater than the few surviving references and texts that actually point back to it. That is exactly what makes it such a powerful mystery. Science can study the manuscripts that preserve versions of the text, trace its transmission through Arabic and Latin traditions, and analyze how its meaning evolved over time. Historians can identify the tablet as a literary and symbolic tradition rather than a recovered green stone artifact sitting safely in a museum. And yet none of that fully dissolves the deeper question: why did this text, so brief and so cryptic, acquire such enormous symbolic force across centuries of intellectual history? Part of the mystery lies in the way the Emerald Tablet seems to promise a unified key to reality while refusing to explain itself plainly. It speaks in compressed symbolic language, hinting at correspondences between heaven and earth, transformation and perfection, matter and spirit. To modern scholarship, much of that can be situated within traditions of alchemy and hermetic thought. But from another angle, the text still feels like a fragment of a much older world of encoded ideas, one that deliberately preserved knowledge in symbolic form rather than direct explanation. And that is why the Emerald Tablet legend belongs this high on the list. It is a mystery science can contextualize but not completely empty of its power. The manuscripts can be dated, the chain of transmission can be studied, the symbolic tradition can be mapped. But the reason this tiny text continued to feel like a key to hidden truth remains harder to explain. It survives as one of the clearest examples of an ancient mystery that may be literary rather than physical, yet still carries the unsettling impression that the past once believed some knowledge should only ever be revealed in fragments. Number 1. The Yonaguni Monument. Beneath the waters off Yonaguni Island in Japan lies a formation that may be one of the most controversial ancient mysteries on Earth. Seen from below the surface, it appears as a vast stepped structure of terraces, angles, sharp edges, and broad stone faces descending into the sea. To some observers, it looks unmistakably artificial, like the remains of a submerged monument or city. To others, it is a natural geological formation shaped by fracturing and erosion into a pattern that only seems designed. And after years of study, science still has not produced a final answer that everyone accepts. That uncertainty is exactly what makes Yonaguni so powerful. This is not a mystery built on rumor alone. Divers have seen it. Photographs and video exist. Geologists, archaeologists, and independent researchers have all examined the site and argued over what it represents. Science can measure the stone, analyze fracture patterns, study the regional geology, and compare the shapes to natural coastal formations. But the visual impact of the monument remains deeply unsettling because it continues to look like something poised right at the edge between nature and intention. If the formation is entirely natural, then it is one of the most extraordinary examples of nature imitating architecture. If it was shaped or modified by human hands, even in part, then the implications become far more dramatic, suggesting a submerged site from a time when sea levels were lower and coastal landscapes very different. That is why Yonaguni refuses to become a settled case. Every interpretation seems to solve one part of the mystery while leaving another part alive. And that is why it takes the number 1 place. The Yonaguni Monument embodies the exact kind of ancient mystery science still cannot fully explain. It is visible, measurable, and intensely studied, yet still suspended between competing realities. It stands, or rather sinks, at the meeting point of evidence, interpretation, geology, archaeology, and human imagination. And perhaps that is what makes it the perfect ending to this list. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries are not the ones hidden completely from view. They are the ones lying right in front of us, clear enough to see but still impossible to explain with certainty.